In this video, I'm going to be examining and going over one of my personal favorite arguments for the existence of God. I'm of course talking about the moral argument for the existence of God. Now there are various types of moral arguments that can be given for God's existence, but one simple one may go something like this. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, but that's exactly the problem. Objective moral values do exist. And finally we arrive at the conclusion, premise 3, therefore, God exists. Now let's go through each individual premise and decide whether or not they hold up. Now in my experience with debating atheists, they're quick to jump on premise 1 and accuse it of committing the logical fallacy known as a false dichotomy, or also better known as a false dilemma. A false dilemma is committed when the presenter of the argument only gives two possibilities, when in reality there could be a third or maybe even a fourth for that matter. But I don't think this is the case for premise 1. The reason why those two possibilities are only given is because simply that, those are the only options that are possible. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. It's just that simple. So what about premise 2? Now most people I've debated on this argument are quick to jump on premise 2 as well because, well, it just seems simple. If you can refute that there are no such things as objective moral values, then surely the argument falls apart, right? Wrong. And the reason why that is because to even claim that there is no such thing as objective moral values, that in of itself is an objective statement. So it's almost like a self-refuting position to take. Now, since we've established that there are such things as objective truths or statements, why not is this the case for morality? Surely all morality just can't be subjective, but everything else can be objective. In other words, you can't claim that all morality is subjective because that in itself is an objective statement. So it just doesn't make sense. For any example that an atheist might point out trying to prove that all morality is subjective, I could easily do that in the case for objective morality. Premise 2 of this argument can be reasonably argued. Think of it as a statement of fact. But there's a bigger issue here that most people just skim by or don't realize, and that is the theist doesn't have to actually prove that objective moral values exist or not. It's up to the atheist's job to prove that morals are subjective, which if they try to, they run into a bit of a problem. The question being asked here is not whether or not objective or subjective moral values are true. The question being asked here is whether or not God exists. Go back to premise 1 of the argument. It stated that if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Therefore, we arrive at premise 3 and the conclusion of the argument that therefore God exists. It's also worth mentioning that when debating atheists sometimes about this argument, they're quick to point out things that seem or appear to be wrong in the Bible or the Quran or whatever, and they suddenly become staunch moralists all of a sudden. So if you find yourself in a debate with an atheist and they begin to do this, they're kind of putting themselves up for an awkward position. First, in order to claim that objective moral values do not exist and that all moral values are subjective is in of itself an objective statement. And then if they proceed to point out things in the Bible or the Quran or whatever, it almost seems like they're arguing for objective moral truth. Now, of course, they'll claim that it's just their subjective opinion about all this, but that just doesn't really work because objective moral values and duties and objective statements do exist. Another thing I've been asked in the past is, why God? Why does God have to be the source of objective moral values? And the answer is simple. I mean, just think about it. If there is such thing as an objective moral law, then there has to be an objective moral lawgiver. So the conclusion of this argument just seems clear as day to me. God does exist because objective moral values and duties do indeed exist. It's literally just that simple. Anyways, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go stone my neighbor to death now for working on the Sabbath. Thank you for watching, subscribe, and don't forget to click that bell icon.